Back in the 1950s, most drivers were middle-aged. The racetracks were lined with bales of hay. There was virtually no safety gear, either in the cars or next to the track, and drivers frequently took care of their own cars. In other words, no team of mechanics waiting in the pits. How Formula One and Formula One cars have evolved in the past 70 years. Join us as we take a look. First up, the most pronounced differences between the 1950s and now. Today, drivers are athletes, and they're coached from a young age. They're expected to reach the Formula One milestone at the latest in their early 20s. Safety is the first concern for the team and their drivers. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on the road to, or the quest for success, and every team has multiple hundreds of employees. In short, like most sports today, F1 has become a business. Keep watching to find out how the cars have changed since 1950 and how racing has transformed in 70 years. Okay, so let's focus on the cars. In this incredible sport, the past 70 years have seen the biggest evolution in cars, all the way from the engine to the components used to build it, to the materials used, and the car's bodywork has changed season by season as technology rapidly advanced. So what did all of this evolution do for performance? Giuseppe Nino Farina won the first Grand Prix at Silverstone on the 13th of May 1950. He took the checkered flag in his Alfa Romeo 158, the same car in which he took the title later the same year. The car was affectionately dubbed the Alfetta. It had a top speed of 180 miles per hour and could make it to 60 miles per hour in around 5 seconds. The F1 cars of today run out of steam at 225 miles per hour and go from standing start to 60 miles per hour in 2 seconds. When the power of the cars is compared, the advances in technology are profoundly displayed. Farina's Alfetta had a 1.5-liter engine, a supercharged inline 8-cylinder that pushed out 350 bhp. Today's F1 cars are typically 1.6-liter V6 turbo hybrid engines that push out 1,000 bhp and use a fraction of the fuel. And everything nowadays is about location, location, location. If you compare the cars from the 1950s with those that race F1 today, the most noticeable difference is the engine placement. The 1950s Steeds were front-engined. The first rear-engined beast would make its appearance at the 1955 World Championship. The 1950 winning Alfetta had a supercharged engine, something that was at the order of the day with most cars that started near the front of the grid. In these engines, compressed air is fed into the cylinders, and this multiplies the explosive potential. Double overhead camshafts operated the inlet and exhaust valves, and those were splayed to achieve the optimal angle for peak combustion. To produce the staggering for the era 350 bhp, the engine created so much heat that fuel was used to cool as well as for combustion. The result was an average consumption of around 1.5 miles per gallon. Today's Formula One monsters average somewhere between 6 and 7 miles per gallon. The engine block was made of electron, a magnesium alloy, a relatively new concept at the time. And what about the gearbox? The 1950 Alfetta had a standard 4-speed H-pattern box and 3 pedals, a clutch, accelerator, and brake. Today's F1 cars have 8 gears, and they're selected by paddles on the steering wheel. That means only 2 pedals in the cockpit. Meanwhile, the aerodynamics also underwent gargantuan changes. Aerodynamics didn't really become a buzzword until the late 1960s. There were no downforce-producing wings or other bodywork features that we take for granted in single-seater racing today. In the 2020s, aerodynamics is probably the biggest differentiator between the performance levels of the various teams. The generation of more and more efficient downforce has improved areas like braking and cornering, allowing F1 cars to reach incredibly high average speeds. The whole Formula One car of today is designed around the concept of aerodynamics. This includes all aspects of the bodywork, the barge boards and side pods, and the front and rear wings. Most of the F1 car of today's downforce is generated by airflow underneath the floor. Okay, and have the tires evolved similarly? Oh, absolutely. Ironically, both the 1950 and 2020 champions raced on Pirelli tires, but that's absolutely where the similarities end, with the brand name. In 1950, tires were skinnier, and they were a standard size for front and rear. Tires started growing wider during the 60s, but they remained grooved. Slicks made their first appearance in the early 70s. They boosted grip levels and dramatically increased both cornering speeds and acceleration. The 2020 tires are huge by comparison to the 1950s vehicles. The front tires are 305mm wide, and the rear measures 405mm. They also come in a range of compounds for different temperatures and strategies. There are 3 types of tires available per race. Tire choice can win or lose a race in today's F1, and only the wet weather tires are grooved. This is to displace water in rainy conditions. Then, the steering wheel. The Alfetta's steering wheel, and that of her counterparts, was as basic as they come. It was typically made of aluminum and wood. Back in those days, steering wheels with buttons and selectors were not even the stuff of science fiction yet. Today's steering wheels have more than 20 interactive elements that make minute changes to the car, depending on the driver's style, the track conditions, the race conditions, and many more factors. Both the gear selection and the clutch are controlled by paddles on the steering wheel's sides. Drivers can also change the brake balance, deploy the DRS, speak to the team over the radio, and adjust the engine settings at the touch of a button. Each driver has a custom-built steering wheel that takes their preferences for button locations into consideration. Okay, and the suspension. The Alfetta of the 1950s was simplistic by comparison to the available technology of the 2020s. It had transverse leaf springs in the front and a swing axle in the rear, which made the rear wheels independent from each other. Compared to the 2020s F1 cars, this is a mere token gesture. Today's F1 car suspension consists of a multitude of springs, rockers, dampers, pull and push rods, wishbones, axles, and a whole lot more. Much of the pre-race setup changes are made to the suspension. Getting that right is essential for the car to be truly competitive during race day. The suspension has also become an integral part of the aerodynamics of the cars. Small tweaks to the suspension change the airflow around the car and make a huge difference to the downforce. All of these factors are considered when setting the car up. And then, the chassis. The bodywork of the 1950s F1 cars was made of standard aluminum, and the chassis was manufactured from tube steel. This kind of space frame construction remained the norm until Colin Chapman's Lotus 25 burst onto the scene in 1962. Carbon fiber came with the McLaren MP41 back in 1981. It's now a staple in F1 and other formulas in motorsport. Carbon fiber is both stronger and lighter than aluminum. It makes for a stiffer chassis and a better driver protection without added extra weight. In fact, between 60 and 70% of today's F1 car is made of carbon fiber. Also, the brakes have changed a lot. The 1950 Alfetta ran on aluminum drum brakes. The front brakes, the less complicated technology, moved to disc brakes, but the rear brakes became really complex. The friction of the discs, electrical braking, and the braking from the engine are all deployed when the brake pedal is pressed. An electrical control unit interprets the brake press and turns it into a series of commands that go to a range of components, and each one plays a role in how the car slows down. To give you an idea of how effective this technology has become, the F1 car of 2020 has 5G of stopping force, and the brakes can withstand temperatures as high as 1,000 degrees. Finally, the biggest one of all, safety. Back in 1950, there was no real concept of safety. The drivers raced in shirt sleeves with a cloth cap and a pair of goggles. But today, safety is the first priority. Crash helmets and bagged fuel tanks were some of the early improvements. That happened when Jackie Stewart started his safety campaign in the late 60s. The survival cell was a key development. It's made of an ultra-strong carbon fiber composite, reinforced with layers of Kevlar that can absorb huge forces in a crash and is also penetration resistant. Also in the late 60s, we saw the introduction of the headrest and the accident data recorder. The Halo is the latest addition to the F1 car's safety arsenal. The initial idea was to move to a closed cockpit, but the Halo won the day and has prevented serious injuries since. Circuits have evolved too. There are better barriers, better medical supervision, and more runoff areas. Some of the older venues have seen modifications to corners and chicanes. This came about after the death of Ayrton Senna in 1994. F1 will never be 100% safe, but it has achieved much over the last 70 years. Most of all, the evolution of the sport has brought more fun, more adventure, and more sheer exhilaration to millions of fans around the world.